The last thing Olivia Carter expected when she picked up a late-night delivery shift was to step into a world that felt like something out of a dream. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the top floor of the most luxurious high-rise in the city. She had delivered food all over town, but never to this building, the kind of place where the doorman barely looked at her before waving her through like she didn't belong. She adjusted the brown paper bag in her hands, her heartbeat quickening as she approached the sleek black double doors of Penthouse 88. She knocked once. No answer. She knocked again, shifting on her feet. "Hello, delivery for She glanced at the receipt. "Mr. Jameson?" The door swung open, and Olivia found herself staring at the most dangerously handsome man she had ever seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an effortless confidence, the man in front of her was dressed in a crisp white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, as if he had run his fingers through it moments before answering the door. But it was his eyes that caught her, the sharp, piercing blue of a storm rolling over the ocean. For a long second, he just looked at her. A slow, unreadable gaze that sent a strange warmth through her chest. Then, as if shaking off whatever thought had just crossed his mind, he cleared his throat. "You're not my usual delivery guy." Olivia blinked, regaining her composure. "Nope, he called in sick. I'm covering for him." She held up the bag. "Your order." He didn't take it right away. Instead, his lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "You don't seem like the delivery type." She raised an eyebrow. "And you don't seem like the type to eat takeout." A chuckle rumbled from his chest. "Fair point." Finally, he reached for the bag, his fingers brushing against hers as he took it. The brief contact sent a jolt up her arm, and she pulled back quickly, resisting the ridiculous urge to shiver. "Well," she said, taking a step back, "enjoy your food, Mr. Jameson." His gaze flicked to her name tag, then back to her face. "Olivia." His voice wrapped around her name like velvet. "Call me Grant." Something about the way he said it made her stomach tighten. She nodded, turning on her heel before she did something stupid like stand there staring at him. But as she waited for the elevator, she could feel his gaze still on her, and when the doors slid closed, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. What the hell was that? She had delivered food to hundreds of people. No one had ever looked at her like that before, and certainly not a man like Grant Jameson. Olivia stepped out of the sleek high-rise, the cool night air rushing against her skin as she made her way back to her scooter. The encounter with Grant Jameson still lingered in her mind, an unexpected moment that had left her oddly unsettled. She had met difficult customers, rude ones, even flirtatious ones, but there had been something entirely different about him. Something that made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't like to analyze. Shaking her head, she pulled on her helmet and started the engine. She needed to focus. She had 2 more deliveries to make before her shift ended, and the last thing she needed was a distraction. By the time she returned to the small apartment she shared with her best friend, Mia, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto the couch, rubbing her temples. Mia, curled up with her laptop, glanced up. "You look like you just ran a marathon." "Close," Olivia muttered. "Long night, and I had to make a delivery to the most ridiculous penthouse I've ever seen." Mia perked up. "Fancy." "Like millionaire fancy. More like billionaire fancy." Olivia leaned back with a sigh. "And the guy who answered the door, unreal." Mia shut her laptop with a grin. "Ooh, tell me everything." Olivia waved a hand. "It's not that exciting. He was just intense, the kind of man who looks at you like he already knows what you're thinking." Mia's eyes widened. "And did he?" "No idea. I got out of there as fast as possible." Mia laughed. "So mysterious billionaire orders takeout and gives you smoldering looks." Sounds like a romance novel waiting to happen. Olivia rolled her eyes. Please. Guys like that don't look twice at girls like me. Maybe this one does. Olivia shook her head, pushing off the conversation. She had real problems to worry about, like making rent and figuring out how to juggle her two jobs. Whatever had passed between her and Grant Jameson was nothing more than a fleeting moment. At least, that's what she told herself. The next evening, Olivia was back on delivery duty, weaving through the city streets. Business was steady, and she was grateful for the distraction. Until she saw the address on her next order. Penthouse 88. Her fingers tightened around the receipt, of course, because the universe had a twisted sense of humor. When she arrived at the building, the doorman gave her a brief nod. Only this time, he seemed to linger as if he recognized her. She ignored it, stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the top floor. The doors opened, and she hesitated for a split second before knocking. This time, Grant answered almost immediately. His gaze flicked over her, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "Olivia," she exhaled. "Didn't expect to be back here so soon." His lips tilted slightly. "Neither did I." She held out the bag. "Your order." He took it, fingers brushing hers just as they had before. But instead of stepping back, he leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "You don't normally do this route, do you?" She frowned. "What makes you say that? You looked surprised the first time you came here." Olivia shifted on her feet. "I cover different shifts when needed." Grant tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to push further, but then he simply said, "I see." An awkward silence threatened to settle between them, and Olivia, never one to let things drag, cleared her throat. "Well, enjoy your food." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Do you always rush off so quickly?" She turned back, raising an eyebrow. "When I'm working." "Yeah." Something flickered in his expression, amusement maybe. "Then I won't keep you." Olivia nodded, stepping into the elevator. As the doors closed, she let out a breath, her pulse unsteady. This was ridiculous. She was not going to let one man, no matter how ridiculously attractive, get under her skin. The next few days passed in a blur of deliveries, long hours, and exhaustion. Olivia made a conscious effort to push the strange encounters with Grant Jameson from her mind. She worked 2 jobs for a reason: to survive, to stay afloat, to keep moving forward, and indulging in fleeting moments with a man so far removed from her world was a distraction she couldn't afford. But fate, apparently, had other plans. She was just finishing a late shift at the cafe when her manager, David, called her over. His expression was unreadable, which usually meant one of 2 things: either someone had complained, or he was going to ask her to pick up another shift. "Olivia, you've got a request," he said, tapping a slip of paper against the counter. She frowned. "A request?" He slid the slip toward her. "Some VIP customer asked for you specifically to cater a private event." Her pulse stuttered as she read the address. Penthouse 88. A slow, simmering frustration bubbled up beneath her skin. She had spent days trying to put Grant Jameson out of her mind, only for him to pull her right back in. David was watching her closely. "You know the guy?" She hesitated. "Not really. Just delivered food to him a couple of times." "Well, whatever you did, he wants you back," he shrugged. "Pays well, double your usual rate." Olivia exhaled sharply. She could use the extra money. Against her better judgment, she nodded. An hour later, she found herself once again stepping into the elevator of the luxury high-rise. Only this time, she wasn't carrying a single brown paper bag. Instead, she held a tray of gourmet appetizers prepared by the cafe's chef, neatly arranged in perfect, delicate portions. When the doors opened, the penthouse was brighter than before, the warm glow of chandeliers illuminating the sleek space. It wasn't empty this time. Guests, men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses, stood in small clusters, glasses of champagne in hand, their conversations a low hum of wealth and power. Olivia scanned the room and spotted him immediately. Grant Jameson stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, engaged in conversation with a man who looked equally powerful. But as if sensing her presence, he glanced up. Their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. Then, as effortlessly as if he had planned it, he excused himself from the conversation and made his way toward her. She braced herself. "You came," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "You requested me," she replied, keeping her tone neutral, his lips curved slightly. "That I did," she exhaled through her nose. "Why?" Instead of answering directly, he glanced at the tray in her hands. "You're working too hard." She tightened her grip. "That's not your concern." He studied her for a long moment, and she hated the way his scrutiny made her feel like he could see past the surface, past the polite mask she wore when dealing with customers. "You intrigue me," he admitted. "I wanted to see you again." Olivia's stomach tightened. She wasn't naive. Men like him didn't take an interest in women like her without a reason, and she refused to be some novelty. "If you wanted to see me," she said, leveling him with a look, "you could have just ordered takeout again." Amusement flickered in his gaze. "Would you have come?" She hesitated but didn't answer. His smile deepened as if he already knew. Before she could respond, a woman in a crimson dress approached, linking her arm through Grant's with a familiarity that made Olivia's stomach twist unexpectedly. The woman was stunning, high cheekbones, perfect posture, the kind of effortless poise that came with old money. "Darling," the woman purred, ignoring Olivia entirely. "I was wondering where you disappeared to." Grant didn't move to untangle himself from her grasp, but he also didn't return the affection. Instead, he glanced at Olivia, something unreadable flashing in his expression. Olivia straightened. Whatever this was, whatever strange moment had existed between them, it had just shattered. "I should get back to work," she said smoothly, stepping back. Grant opened his mouth as if to say something, but she had already turned, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. She had been right all along. She didn't belong in his world, and she never would. Olivia maneuvered through the crowd, balancing the tray of appetizers with precision. The weight of the interaction with Grant clung to her, but she forced herself to focus. She was here to work, not to get caught up in whatever game he was playing. A waiter in a crisp black uniform approached, motioning to take the tray from her hands. She handed it over without hesitation, relieved to have one less thing to juggle. The penthouse was a whirlwind of conversation and movement, the air filled with the scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey. The guests, effortlessly poised, spoke in low, measured tones, their laughter carefully curated to match the elegance of the evening. Olivia had worked enough events to recognize the difference between genuine enjoyment and the kind of social dance that came with power and wealth. This was the latter. Every interaction was calculated, every glance a silent negotiation. She made her way toward the far end of the room, keeping her movements deliberate. The last thing she wanted was to cross paths with Grant again, especially with the woman still attached to his side. She had seen enough. A cluster of executives stood near the bar, their conversation peppered with finance jargon and references to exclusive investments. Olivia caught snippets as she passed, the sheer scale of their discussions staggering. It was another reminder that this world was light years away from her own. She would finish her shift, collect her pay, and leave. That was the plan, but plans rarely went as expected. A man with silver-streaked hair and an air of effortless authority stepped into her path, offering a polite but firm nod. His suit was impeccable, his posture commanding. He wasn't just another guest, he was someone important. "You're not one of the usual caterers," he observed, his tone neutral but assessing. Olivia straightened instinctively. I was asked to cover for tonight. His gaze flicked over her, sharp but not unkind. Interesting? She didn't know what to make of that, but before she had the chance to respond, Grant appeared at her side. His presence was immediate, the air between them shifting. "Olivia," he said, his tone smoother than before, but there was something beneath it, something more deliberate. The older man looked between them, an eyebrow lifting slightly. "You know each other." Grant didn't hesitate. "She's handled a few deliveries for me." The words felt carefully chosen, restrained in a way that made Olivia wonder what he wasn't saying. The older man studied her for another moment before offering a small, knowing smile. "Well, it seems you've made an impression." Grant didn't reply, but his expression remained composed. Olivia, unsure of what to say, simply inclined her head. "If you'll excuse me, I should get back to work." She turned before either of them could stop her, slipping away once more. She didn't stop moving until she reached the outer balcony, the cool night air hitting her skin like a welcome reprieve. The city stretched before her, glittering and endless. She exhaled slowly, gripping the railing. This job was supposed to be simple, straightforward, but Grant Jameson had a way of complicating things. The night air was crisp against Olivia's skin as she stood on the penthouse balcony, gripping the cool metal railing. The hum of conversation from inside faded into the background, replaced by the distant sounds of the city below. She needed a moment to breathe, to shake off the strange tension that had settled over her ever since stepping into this world. She had been in plenty of high-end spaces before, working catering jobs that took her into the orbit of the wealthy, but this was different. This wasn't just any gathering, this was Grant Jameson's world, and for reasons she couldn't quite grasp, he had deliberately pulled her into it. A soft footstep behind her made her shoulders tense. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You disappeared." Grant's voice was smooth, controlled. Olivia exhaled. "I finished my part inside." A pause. "Then you didn't have to take this job." She turned to face him, tilting her head slightly. "You requested me." His expression remained unreadable, but his gaze was sharp, assessing. "You could have said no." She folded her arms. "I could have, but the pay was good." His lips curved just slightly as if her answer amused him. "Practical." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that surprising?" "No," he admitted, stepping closer, just enough that she could catch the faint scent of something expensive and clean, something that belonged entirely to him. "But I get the sense you don't like being where you don't belong." Something in her chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "And you think I don't belong here?" His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "I think you don't want to." She held his stare for a beat longer than she probably should have. He wasn't wrong. There was a part of her that had spent the entire night feeling like an outsider, like she was playing a role in a scene she was never meant to be a part of. But what unsettled her wasn't that Grant saw it was that he cared enough to notice. Before she could respond, the door to the balcony opened again, and a new voice cut through the air. "There you are, Grant." Olivia turned just in time to see the woman in the crimson dress step into the space, her sharp eyes flicking between them. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. "I was wondering where you disappeared to." Olivia recognized the tone casual, but edged with something possessive. Grant didn't step away from Olivia, didn't immediately move to acknowledge the woman's presence. Instead, there was a brief, almost imperceptible moment where he hesitated. Then finally, he turned his head slightly. "Is there something you need, Victoria?" Victoria. The name suited her elegant, commanding. Victoria's gaze lingered on Olivia for half a second too long before she tilted her head, her expression effortlessly poised. "I was just about to leave and thought I'd say goodnight." Grant nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Safe travels." There was something dismissive about the way he said it, something that suggested whatever history existed between them, it was firmly in the past. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, annoyance, perhaps. She turned to Olivia, her gaze cool but polite. "You must be the caterer." Olivia had spent enough time around people like her to recognize that the words weren't meant as an introduction, they were meant as a reminder of the difference between them. But Olivia had never been the type to back down. She met Victoria's gaze evenly. "That's right." Victoria's smile remained, but the amusement in her eyes sharpened. "Well, I suppose everyone has their place." A slow heat crept up Olivia's spine, but before she could respond, Grant's voice cut through the moment. "Good night, Victoria." The words weren't harsh, but they were final. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if debating whether to say something else. But then, with a slight incline of her head, she turned and disappeared back inside. Silence stretched between Olivia and Grant, heavy with unspoken words. She exhaled, shaking her head. "She doesn't like me." Grant's lips twitched. "Victoria doesn't like anyone she can't control." Olivia let out a short laugh despite herself. "Well, that explains a lot." His gaze lingered on her, something thoughtful in his expression. "You held your ground," she shrugged. "I've dealt with worse." His eyes darkened slightly, as if the implication of her words meant more to him than she intended. Before he could say anything, Olivia straightened. "I should go." Something flickered across his face, but he nodded. She turned to leave, but as her fingers brushed the door handle, his voice stopped her. "Olivia," she hesitated, looking back. His expression had shifted, something more serious settling in his features. "This isn't the last time we'll see each other." A strange sensation curled in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. "That sounds like a warning." His lips curved slightly, but his eyes didn't waver. "It's a promise." She didn't wait to respond. Instead, she stepped back inside, the warmth of the penthouse pressing against her as she made her way toward the exit. She didn't look back. But as she stepped into the elevator, her heart pounded in a way she couldn't quite ignore. The city streets blurred past as Olivia steered her scooter through the steady hum of nighttime traffic. The wind whipped against her skin, but it did little to cool the heat still simmering beneath her surface. Grant's words echoed in her mind, refusing to be ignored. "This isn't the last time we'll see each other." A promise, a warning, a challenge. She didn't know which it was, but she knew one thing for certain: Grant Jameson wasn't the kind of man who said things lightly. By the time she reached her apartment, she felt the weight of exhaustion settle over her shoulders. The night had been long, and she wanted nothing more than to collapse onto her bed and let sleep take her. But as she stepped inside, Mia was already waiting for her, perched on the couch with an expectant look. Olivia barely had time to close the door before Mia pounced. "Okay, spill." She sighed, kicking off her shoes. "Spill what?" Mia scoffed. "Don't play dumb." "You've been weird ever since that delivery to the penthouse, and now, suddenly, you're catering a private event there." She narrowed her eyes. "You're not telling me something." Olivia hesitated. She had told herself she wasn't going to dwell on Grant, wasn't going to let him get under her skin. But Mia knew her too well to let it go. "Fine," she muttered, sinking onto the couch. "Grant Jameson is complicated." Mia's brows shot up. "First-name basis already," she groaned. "That's not the point." She paused, searching for the right words. "He's intense. He notices things, and for some reason he's interested in me." Mia blinked. "Interested how?" "Like, he requested me specifically for the event. And then spent half the night watching me like I was some kind of puzzle he wanted to solve." Mia let out a low whistle. "That's either incredibly hot or incredibly dangerous." "Probably both," Olivia muttered. Mia studied her. "And how do you feel about it?" Olivia hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? Because if she were honest, Grant unsettled her in ways she wasn't used to. He was too perceptive, too controlled, too willing to push past the surface of things. But she also couldn't deny the way her pulse reacted when he was near, the way his presence filled a room without effort. "It doesn't matter how I feel," she said finally. "He's from a completely different world. Whatever this is, it's not real." Mia didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she leaned back, studying Olivia with a knowing look. "If it wasn't real, you wouldn't be thinking about him this much." Olivia scowled. "Go to bed." Mia laughed but didn't argue. As Olivia lay in bed that night, she told herself that Mia was wrong. But deep down, she had a sinking feeling she wasn't. The next day, Olivia was back at work, throwing herself into her shifts with renewed determination. She needed to get her mind off Grant, and the best way to do that was to stay busy. But just when she thought she was in the clear, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello," a smooth, familiar voice greeted her. "Olivia." Her breath caught for half a second before she forced herself to steady. "How did you get my number?" Grant didn't sound the least bit apologetic. "I have my ways," she exhaled sharply. "That's not an answer." There was a pause then. "I wanted to see you again." Her grip tightened on the phone. "You don't even know me." "That's what I'd like to change." Something in his tone made her pulse stutter. He wasn't just being flirtatious, he was serious. She shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. "Grant, I don't know what kind of game this is, but it's not a game." His voice was firm. "Meet me for dinner tonight." Olivia laughed, but it was hollow. "You don't ask, do you?" "I don't waste time," she hesitated. Every rational part of her screamed to say no, to walk away before she got caught up in something she couldn't control. But her curiosity got the better of her. Against her better judgment, she sighed. "One dinner, that's it." She could almost hear the smile in his voice. "I'll send a car." Before she could argue, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, heart pounding. What had she just agreed to? The car was waiting for Olivia outside the cafe just as Grant had promised. It was sleek, black, and unmistakably expensive, the kind of vehicle that turned heads. She hesitated for a brief moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse before she took a steadying breath and slid into the back seat. The driver acknowledged her with a polite nod before pulling into the steady hum of city traffic. Olivia kept her gaze fixed on the skyline, the towering buildings illuminated against the evening sky. She had no idea where Grant was taking her, but she had the distinct feeling this wouldn't be just any dinner. When they finally pulled up to a restaurant, she wasn't surprised to see that it wasn't a typical five-star venue. Instead, it was something far more exclusive, a place without a sign, tucked away in a quiet street, the kind of establishment only the truly powerful knew existed. The doorman opened her door before she could react, and she stepped out, smoothing the fabric of her dress. Grant was waiting just inside, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that looked like it had been made for him, which it probably had. His gaze swept over her the moment she entered, something flickering in his expression before he gestured for her to follow him deeper into the restaurant. The interior was understated elegance, dark wood, soft lighting, and a quiet hum of conversation from patrons who clearly belonged there. A private table had already been set for them near the back, and as Olivia slid into her seat, she forced herself to remember why she had agreed to this in the first place. One dinner, nothing more. Grant sat across from her, his expression unreadable as the waiter poured them both a glass of wine without a word. "You came," he said, his voice smoother than the expensive wine resting in front of him. "You didn't exactly give me much of a choice," Olivia replied, lifting the glass but not taking a sip just yet. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "You had a choice, you still do." She met his gaze evenly. "Then why me?" Grant leaned back slightly, studying her as if weighing how much to say. "You're different," she scoffed. "That's vague." A small smirk tugged at his lips, but his tone remained serious. You don't belong in my world, but you don't try to fit into it either. You don't pretend. You don't flatter. You see things for what they are. Olivia tilted her head slightly, and that's rare. His expression didn't waver. You have no idea. The words sat between them, heavy with something unspoken. She could feel the intensity behind them, the way he wasn't just saying them to charm her. He meant them. Before she could respond, the first course arrived, the dishes placed in front of them with quiet efficiency. Olivia glanced down at the plate, something delicate, artfully arranged, the kind of food that came with a price tag that made her stomach turn. This is the kind of place where people discuss business, not just eat, she noted, picking up her fork. Grant inclined his head slightly. That's true, she studied him. So why bring me here? He didn't hesitate. Because I wanted to see how you'd handle it, her brows lifted. And, his lips curved slightly, you haven't disappointed me yet. The conversation shifted after that, moving into unfamiliar territory. He didn't ask her about her job, her struggles, or the things she had expected him to pry into. Instead, he asked about things that caught her off guard, her opinions on books, places she wanted to visit, the kind of life she would have chosen if circumstances had been different. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia found herself answering without thinking too much, without filtering her words. By the time the final course arrived, she realized she had let her guard down more than she should have. She set her fork down, exhaling softly. This was unexpected. Grant's gaze met hers. In a good way, she hesitated for a beat before nodding. Yes, something flickered in his expression, something almost satisfied. But before she could think too much about it, the waiter approached, murmuring something quietly to Grant. Grant's expression darkened slightly, just for a moment, before he nodded once. Olivia noticed the shift immediately. What is it? He glanced at her, his jaw tightening slightly. Nothing you need to worry about. She frowned, but before she could press further, he stood. I'll have the driver take you home. Olivia stood as well, eyeing him carefully. You're leaving. Something came up. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something restrained. She hesitated. Grant, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black card and placed it onto the table before she could refuse. Thank you for dinner, he said, his voice lower now. I'll see you again, Olivia. And then, before she could say anything else, he was gone. She stared after him, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. He had said it with certainty. Like it wasn't a question, like it was inevitable. Olivia hadn't expected to see Grant again so soon, but less than 24 hours after their dinner. Another black car pulled up outside the cafe just as she was locking up. She hesitated, fingers tightening around her keys as the back door opened. Grant stepped out, his movements smooth, effortless. His suit was different from the night before, this one darker, more severe, but the intensity in his gaze was unchanged. She exhaled. You have a habit of showing up unannounced. His lips curved slightly. You have a habit of leaving before I'm ready to let you go. The words sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, but she pushed it aside. Is that why you're here? To make sure I don't disappear. Grant stepped closer, the city lights casting shadows across his sharp features. I left last night because I had to. Not because I wanted to. Something in his voice made her pulse stutter. There was weight behind those words, something unspoken that she wasn't sure she was ready to unravel. She tilted her head. And now, his gaze didn't waver. Now I don't have any distractions. The air between them shifted, thick with something neither of them spoke aloud. She could have walked away. She should have. But instead she found herself saying, "Where are we going?" Grant's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, satisfaction maybe. He held out a hand. Come with me and find out. Against every rational thought, Olivia took it. The ride through the city was quieter than she expected. Grant didn't fill the silence with unnecessary conversation, and she found herself grateful for it. There was something strangely comfortable about sitting beside him in the back of the car, the hum of the engine a steady backdrop to her thoughts. She had no idea where he was taking her, but when they finally stopped, she realized they weren't at another restaurant or private venue. They were at the edge of the city where the skyline met the water. She stepped out, the night air crisp against her skin. In front of them, a yacht waited, its lights reflecting against the dark waves. She turned to Grant, raising an eyebrow. "This is casual for you, isn't it?" His lips twitched. "Would you rather I had taken you somewhere else?" She exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't know what to do with you." He stepped closer, his voice lower now. "Then stop trying to figure it out." A shiver ran down her spine, but she didn't back away. Without another word, he led her onto the yacht. The interior was sleek, modern, a quiet elegance that didn't scream for attention but demanded it nonetheless. A private table had been set on the deck, overlooking the water. Olivia let out a breath, running a hand through her hair. "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" Grant pulled out a chair for her. "Not when it matters." She hesitated for half a second before sitting. As the yacht began to move, cutting smoothly through the water, she realized just how different this was from last night. Their first dinner had been calculated, a test of sorts. This felt like something else entirely. She picked up her glass, studying him across the table. "You're not used to people questioning you, are you?" Grant leaned back slightly, regarding her with quiet amusement. "Not often," she smirked. "I can tell." He exhaled through his nose, but there was something almost fond in his expression. "And yet you do it so effortlessly," she shrugged. "Someone has to keep you on your toes." His gaze darkened slightly. "I don't mind." The way he said it sent warmth curling in her stomach, but she forced herself to focus. She set her glass down. "You never told me why you left last night." Grant's features tightened, but he didn't look away. "Business." She raised an eyebrow. "That's vague." His jaw flexed. "Because it doesn't matter." She studied him for a beat longer before deciding to let it go. For now. Instead, she leaned back, glancing at the water. "You know, for someone who doesn't waste time, you're spending an awful lot of it on me." Grant didn't hesitate. "Because you're not a waste of time." Her breath caught. She had no response to that, and he didn't push her for one. The night stretched on, the conversation shifting between light-hearted teasing and moments of quiet intensity. Olivia found herself forgetting what she had told Mia, forgetting that this was supposed to be nothing more than a passing moment. Because with Grant, it never felt like just a moment. As they docked back at the pier, she felt an unexpected weight settle in her chest. Grant stepped off first, turning to hold out a hand. She hesitated, but only for a second before taking it. The city lights stretched before them, but she barely noticed. Because when Grant looked at her like that, like she was something he wasn't willing to let slip away, she knew she was in trouble. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she cared. The car ride back to Olivia's apartment was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was charged, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She could still feel the warmth of Grant's touch on her hand from when he had helped her off the yacht, the way his fingers had lingered just a second too long. She was in deeper than she had ever intended to be. When the car stopped in front of her building, she hesitated before reaching for the door handle. Grant, seated beside her, watched her closely, his expression unreadable but intent. She turned to face him, searching for the right words. This wasn't supposed to happen. His gaze didn't waver. And yet here we are. A slow breath left her lips, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. "I don't fit into your life, Grant." His jaw tensed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "You think I care about that?" She shook her head, frustration and something dangerously close to longing curling in her chest. "Maybe you don't, but the rest of your world does. Grant leaned forward slightly, the space between them shrinking. I don't live my life based on what others think. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let herself get swept up in the moment. That's easy for you to say. You don't have to prove yourself every second of the day just to be taken seriously. His expression darkened, not in anger but in something deeper, something almost protective. You think I don't see that? That I don't know how much harder you've had to fight for everything you have? Her breath caught. He wasn't just saying what he thought she wanted to hear, he meant it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the car seemed distant, insignificant compared to the storm raging between them. Then, finally, Grant exhaled, his voice lower now. Tell me you didn't feel it tonight. Olivia's throat tightened. She could lie, pretend that tonight had meant nothing, but she wasn't sure she had the strength to. Instead, she whispered, "That's the problem." His expression shifted, something softer flickering in his gaze. Then let it be a problem we figure out together. She hated how much she wanted to believe him, but she had spent her entire life knowing that fairy tales weren't real. With a deep breath, she reached for the door. Good night, Grant. He didn't stop her. He didn't try to convince her. But as she stepped out of the car and walked toward her building, she could feel his eyes on her, burning into her back. And she knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. The next morning, Olivia threw herself into work, hoping that the steady rhythm of her shifts would drown out the thoughts swirling in her mind. But no matter how many orders she filled, no matter how many deliveries she made, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She had spent so much time convincing herself that whatever was happening between her and Grant was temporary, fleeting. But the way he had looked at her last night, like she was something worth holding on to, made her wonder if she had been wrong. By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She was about to head home when a familiar figure stepped into the cafe. Grant. He wasn't in a suit this time. Instead, he wore a dark sweater and tailored slacks, somehow managing to look just as effortlessly powerful. Her pulse jumped, but she forced herself to stay composed as she approached. What are you doing here? His gaze met hers, steady and unyielding. You walked away last night, I let you. A pause. I won't make that mistake again. Olivia's breath hitched. The cafe bustled around them, but in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the room. She swallowed hard. Grant, he took a step closer, his voice quieter now. I don't care where you come from, Olivia. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I want you. Her chest tightened. He wasn't just saying this to get his way, he meant it, and that terrified her. People like you don't end up with people like me, she whispered. His jaw clenched. Then I guess I'll just have to prove you wrong. Her world was spinning, every carefully constructed wall she had built around herself crumbling under the weight of his words. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop it. Olivia stood there, staring at him, her pulse hammering in her ears. Grant wasn't asking for a chance, he was demanding one. His unwavering confidence should have irritated her, should have made her push him away. But instead, it unraveled her. She exhaled, glancing around the cafe where patrons carried on with their lives, oblivious to the war raging inside her. Grant wasn't just offering her something fleeting, he was offering something real, and that terrified her more than anything. But she was done running. Without another word, she turned and walked past him, heading toward the door. She didn't look back, didn't wait to see if he'd follow. She didn't need to, because she knew he would. Outside, the evening air was cool, brushing against her skin as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The city buzzed around them, but Olivia only felt Grant's presence as he came up beside her. She finally faced him. You really don't give up, do you? His expression remained steady, determined, not when it matters. A long pause stretched between them. Then finally, she let herself believe him. A small, almost disbelieving laugh escaped her lips. You really mean it? Grant's gaze softened, but there was still a fire behind it. I do. Her chest tightened, a strange warmth spreading through her. She had spent so long convincing herself that people like him didn't see people like her, that the lines between their worlds were unbreakable. But Grant had shattered every assumption, had pushed past every wall she had built, and she was tired of pretending she didn't want this. She exhaled, shaking her head. Then don't make me regret this. His lips curved slightly. I won't. And then he reached for her, his fingers brushing against hers before fully taking her hand. It wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate, it was steady, certain, just like him. Olivia squeezed back a silent answer. This was real, and she was finally ready to let it be. Weeks passed, and the shift in Olivia's life was undeniable. She had expected Grant to grow bored, to lose interest once the chase was over. But he didn't. If anything, he became more present, more intertwined in her world. He showed up at the cafe unannounced, not in a grand, dramatic fashion, but simply to see her, to steal a few moments between her shifts. He learned which pastries she liked best, the exact way she took her coffee. He didn't try to change her life, he just made space for himself in it. And Olivia found herself doing the same. She stopped resisting the pull between them, stopped questioning every moment. She let herself enjoy the way he looked at her like she was something rare, something worth holding on to. For the first time in a long time, she let herself be happy. One evening, Grant surprised her with something completely unexpected. He didn't take her to another extravagant restaurant or whisk her away to some exclusive venue. Instead, he took her back to where it all started, Penthouse 88. But this time, it wasn't just another delivery. This time, he had turned the space into something entirely different. Soft, golden lighting illuminated the penthouse, casting a warm glow over the sleek furnishings. A table had been set near the window, overlooking the city skyline. Candles flickered, their flames dancing against the glass, and at the center of it all was Grant, standing beside the table, waiting for her. Olivia stepped inside, taking it all in. I thought I should be the one to bring you dinner for once, he said, amusement lacing his tone. She let out a breath, shaking her head. You're impossible, his lips twitched. And yet you're still here. She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Yes, she was still here, and she wasn't going anywhere. That night, as they stood by the window, looking out over the city, Olivia leaned into him, letting her head rest against his shoulder. Grant's arm tightened around her, pulling her closer. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about what came next or whether this would last. Because for once, she wasn't afraid of the future. She was living it, with him. And that was enough.